The rain had begun before the last mourners reached the lich gate. A cold October rain that darkened the stones of St. Edmund's and collected in the folds of Vivian Ashvale's black crepe veil. She still held the order of service, her father's name printed at the top in neat Roman lettering, the ink beginning to blur at the edges where the paper had taken the wet. She had not moved from the church steps. She was not ready to move. The churchyard was still half full, people speaking in low voices, glancing at her with the careful sidelong sympathy that the county had been directing at her for a decade. The sympathy one extends to a woman who has made herself useful and therefore invisible. And then she heard footsteps on the stone path, deliberate, measured, a man's footsteps accompanied by a second set, quicker and more tentative. And she looked up, and she saw Oliver Pemberton coming toward her with his solicitor at his elbow, and the order of service grew damp in her hand. He was formally dressed, his morning coat precisely fitted, his expression set in the particular way of a man who has decided something unpleasant and is proceeding with it before his nerve can fail. The solicitor, Good, she would learn his name later, carried a leather satchel and kept his eyes slightly averted from hers. Half the county was still present. Every one of them could see what was happening. Oliver Pemberton stopped 2 feet from Vivian Ashvale on the church steps above her father's newly filled grave, and he told her she had until sunset to remove her personal effects from Ashvale House, as the estate passed in its entirety to the next male heir. He said it without cruelty. That was the thing she would remember. He said it the way a man states a legal fact, clearly, without embellishment, without the grace of pretending it might be otherwise. And Vivian stood in the rain with her father's name dissolving in her hand, and looked at Oliver Pemberton for a long moment. The way a woman looks at something she intends to memorize. And then she reached out and took the solicitor's card directly from Good's hand. Her fingers brushed the sleeve of Oliver's coat, half a second, no more, and she felt him step back, as though she had pressed something sharp against him. His composure broke just there, just for that half second, and then it reassembled, and he stood straight, and she turned and walked back through the lich gate alone. She did not look back. She did not need to. She knew precisely what the county was seeing, and she knew precisely what it would say. And none of that was the thing she needed to think about before sunset. By 4 o'clock, she had removed one trunk, her father's pocket watch, which she had wound every evening for the last 3 years of his illness, and 8 years of household accounts, which she carried out in 2 leather document cases while the footman watched from the hall and said nothing, because no one in Ashvale's employ had ever been quite certain what those cases contained or whether they were important. They were not important in any way that a man looking at them would recognize. They were ledgers. They were correspondence files. They were 8 years of decisions made by a woman whose name appeared nowhere in the estate's formal records. No one stopped her. By sunset, she was in a borrowed room above the farmhouse of Thomas Kett, one of Ashvale's tenant farmers, whose wife had pressed bread and cold meat on her without speaking, and whose children had been sent to bed early. Vivian sat at the small table by the window, with the estate ledger open in front of her, and read until her eyes grew heavy. The columns of figures as familiar to her as her own handwriting, because they were her own handwriting. Every entry, every correction, every note in the margin, about which fields had drained poorly, and which tenant had paid in kind when the harvest failed. She fell asleep with the ledger open, and the candle burned down to the socket. And in the morning, she woke with the cold and the particular stillness of a woman who has not yet begun to understand just what has happened to her. She gave herself 2 days. She did not weep, or if she did, it was briefly and in private, the way she had learned to do everything that mattered. On the 3rd morning, she walked the field boundary at the edge of Kett's farm and looked across the valley toward Ashvale House, its windows catching the pale autumn light. And she thought about her father, who had been dying slowly for 10 years and had never once told her she was doing anything wrong, which she had taken, in her more tired moments, to mean that he simply had not noticed. She had not yet understood that it meant something else entirely. On the third day after the funeral, she heard a horse on the farm lane at mid-morning, and when she came to the kitchen window, she saw a gray-haired man dismounting at the gate, with the careful movements of someone whose joints had begun to protest the cold. She did not know him. She opened the door before he could knock. "Miss Ashvale?" he said. "My name is Alderton. I was your father's solicitor, his private solicitor, retained separately from the estate's legal representation. I have been trying to reach you since the morning of the funeral. I left 3 letters at Ashvale House." Vivian looked at him for a moment. "They would not have been passed on," she said. "Come in." She put the kettle on while Alderton removed his coat and set his satchel on the kitchen table. He was a small, precise man with the manner of someone accustomed to delivering news that required a chair, and he waited until she had sat down before he opened the satchel and placed a folded document on the table between them. "I need you to read this before I say anything further," Alderton said. "I find that explanations given before the document is read tend to obscure rather than illuminate." Vivian unfolded the document. It was a deed, the language dense, the parchment old, the formal Latin heading at the top identifying it as the creation instrument of the Dukedom of Ashval. She read it once, slowly. Then she turned back to the beginning and read it again. The remainder clause was in the 3rd section. It was not ambiguous. The Dukedom of Ashvale, created in the year of its original patent, descended in the first instance to male heirs of the body, and in the absence of such heirs, to daughters of the blood of the original grantee, without limitation. Vivienne set the document down on the table and was quiet for a long time. "There are no male heirs," she said. "There have been none for 30 years, Alderton said. "Your father was the last male heir of the original line. The Pemberton claim was always a collateral one, descended from a female connection 2 generations back. It was never a valid claim under this remainder. The dukedom cannot pass to a collateral male line when a direct female heir exists." Vivienne looked at the deed. She looked at her own hands on the table. "When did my father know this?" she asked. "He has known since he inherited," Alderton said. "He retained me specifically to preserve the deed and to ensure it was presented to you at the appropriate time." "The appropriate time," Vivienne said, her voice careful and even. "He was concerned," Alderton said carefully, "that if you knew during his lifetime, you would spend the years of his illness fighting legal battles rather than—" He paused. "He said you would worry about it instead of letting him see your face at breakfast." Vivian did not move. The kitchen was very quiet, and outside the window, a robin was working at the frozen ground near the gate, and the sound of it was very small and very clear. "I need you to say nothing for 5 more days," she said at last. Alderton looked at her. "Miss Ashvale?" "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was perfectly level. "But not yet, not publicly. 5 days." She folded the deed and held it in both hands. "There is something I need to see first." Oliver Pemberton had taken possession of Ashvale on the morning after the funeral, with the efficiency of a man who has been preparing for a thing for a long time and is relieved to finally be doing it. He had the keys from Good. He had a letter from the estate's formal solicitor, not Alderton, whom he did not know existed, confirming the transfer. He had, he believed, everything he needed. By the end of the 2nd day, the meals were running late. Not dramatically, 20 minutes, 30, but enough that Oliver noticed, and when he asked Mrs. Fenn, the housekeeper, she told him that the kitchen correspondence had always been handled directly, and that she was not certain where the supplier accounts were kept. Who handled it? Oliver asked. Mrs. Fenn looked at him with the expression of a woman deciding how much truth to deliver. Miss Ashvale managed the domestic accounts, she said. The supplier correspondence, the quarterly settlements, the staff rotas, all of it. Oliver said he would find the files. He did not find the files, because the files had left in 2 leather document cases 3 days earlier. On the 3rd day, 2 tenant farmers arrived at the front door, Ket and a man named Marsh, with a drainage complaint that had apparently been reviewed and resolved every autumn by someone whose name neither of them could agree on, but whom both described, independently, as someone who actually understood the problem. Oliver told them he would look into it. He did not have the drainage records. The steward could not locate them. On the 4th day, Mrs. Fenn left a note on the hall table and was gone by noon. The note said, "I hope the new Duke finds things to his satisfaction." It was signed with her full name and the date, and nothing else, and Oliver read it twice and set it down and went to his grandfather's study, where the old papers were kept. He had come to the papers looking for the legal foundation, the document that would confirm what Good had told him all his adult life. That the Ashvale remainder was a straightforward male-line succession, and the Pemberton claim was unassailable. He expected to find a tidy file. He found instead 4 decades of contested correspondence, bundled in chronological order, beginning with his grandfather's first approach to Good's predecessor, and running forward to a letter dated 6 months before his grandfather's death. He read for 3 hours. Good's name appeared on every document. Not as a disinterested legal advisor, as an architect. The letters described, in the careful language of men who knew they were writing things that should not be written down, a deliberate decision to suppress a remainder clause that had been known to Good's firm since the original patent was filed. The deed had been seen. It had been assessed. And it had been set aside, on the grounds that no one would look for it, if no one knew to look. Oliver sat with the letters in his lap, in the fire burning low beside him, and understood, for the first time, that the ground he had been standing on for 42 years was not the ground he had believed it to be. He rode to Ket's farm the following morning. He did not go in. He told himself he had not decided what to say, which was true, and also that he needed to see something first, which was less clearly defined, but equally true. He came around the side of the farmhouse to where the kitchen garden opened behind a low stone wall, and he saw Vivian Ashvale kneeling in the cold earth between the bare beds. Her black mourning skirts dark against the frost-pale soil, working at something near the base of a dormant rose with a small hand fork. She did not look up. He was not certain she knew he was there, and he found he did not want to announce himself, not yet. Not until he had decided what the announcement would contain. He stood at the gate for a long time. Then he removed his riding coat, folded it once, and laid it over the top of the gatepost. He mounted and rode back toward Ashvale House without speaking. Vivian did not put the coat on. She finished what she was doing. And then she went indoors, and an hour later she brought the coat inside with her, folded precisely along its original crease, and set it on the back of a chair. She did not examine what that meant. She had learned, over many years, not to examine things until she was certain she had enough information to draw a conclusion. The next morning she was walking the lane between Ket's farm and the village, when she heard a horse behind her, and then the horse slowing, and she kept walking. She heard him dismount. She kept walking. "Miss Ashvale," Oliver said. She stopped. She turned around. He was standing in the lane with the reins in his hand, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept well. He was without his coat again. He had apparently not thought to retrieve it. And the morning was cold enough that she could see his breath. "I have been reading my grandfather's papers," he said. "The letters from Good's firm. They do not match what I was told about the remainder clause." He paused. "I want to ask whether you know what the Ashvale deed says." She met his gaze steadily. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "How long have you known?" "4 days," she said. Something moved across his face, not anger, not quite. Something that required a moment to settle into a shape she could name. "You did not tell me," he said. "No," Vivian said. "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I wanted you to find it yourself," she said. "And you did." He was quiet for a long time. A cart passed at the far end of the lane, and the sound of the wheels on the frozen road filled the silence between them. And then it faded. "Walk back with me," he said. It was not quite a request. She considered him for a moment, then turned and walked. He fell into step beside her, leading the horse, and they went the length of the lane without speaking. And when they reached the farm gate, he reached past her and opened it. The automatic motion of a man who has done such things without thinking. And his hand came to rest briefly at the small of her back as she passed through. He removed it immediately. Vivian walked 3 steps into the yard and stopped, her back still to him. "You may do that again," she said, "if you mean it." She went inside without waiting for his answer. He came to the farm that night at 7 o'clock with a letter in his hand. Vivian heard the knock and opened the door herself, because the Ketts had gone to bed early, and she found Oliver Pemberton on the step with rain on his shoulders and the look of a man who has been carrying something for too long and has finally decided to set it down. "I found this among my cousin's papers," he said. "It was misfiled. It had been there for 30 years. I think you should read it." She brought him into the small parlor and lit a second candle, and he stood by the fireplace while she unfolded the letter and read it. It was written in a hand she did not recognize, a man's hand, formal but warm, and it was addressed to her father. It had been written 30 years ago by Oliver's father, and it described the Duke of Ashvale in terms that made Vivian's breath steady and slow in her chest. "The best man I have ever known," it said, "and the one whose opinion of me I have most wished to deserve." The letter went on. It said, plainly and without equivocation, that Oliver's father had never wanted the Ashvale dukedom, that the contest had been his own father's obsession, not his, and that he would have surrendered the claim without argument if he had believed surrendering it would end the enmity. "The enmity," the letter said, "is not mine. I did not make it. I do not know how to unmake it from where I stand. But I want you to know that my son, if he is raised well, will not inherit it from me." Vivian set the letter down on her knee. The fire had burned low while she read, and the room was very still. "He manufactured it," Oliver said. "My grandfather. The whole of it, the legal contest, the family enmity, the certainty I grew up with that your father's claim was fraudulent. My own father wrote that he never wanted any of it." He stopped. "I have spent my entire life defending something my father would have surrendered." "I know," Vivian said. "My father told me. Not the letter. He never knew about the letter. But he told me your father was a different kind of man than his own." Oliver looked at her. "He told you that?" "He told me a great many things in the last years," Vivian said. "We had a great deal of time." They sat in the parlor until the fire went to ash, not speaking much, and what they did say was quiet and specific. A detail about her father's last winter. A thing Oliver remembered his own father saying that he had not understood at the time. When the cold finally became impossible to ignore, Oliver rose and reached for his coat. She said his name then, Oliver, and stopped, because she had spoken it without intending to, and the sound of it in the room was very clear. He turned. She picked up the letter from her knee and held it out to him. "Keep it," she said. "You will need it to be decent." He took the letter. He held it for a moment, looking at her in the near dark of the spent fire. Then he went out into the rain, and she listened to the horses' hooves on the lane until she could not hear them any more. And she sat in the cold parlor for a long time after. 3 days later, Alderton came to the farm with news that made the morning feel suddenly colder than it was. "Good approached me yesterday," Alderton said, setting his cup down on the kitchen table. "He came to my office in the market town. He offered money, a considerable sum, to delay the legal proceedings. He suggested that a quiet resolution, reached privately and without formal record, would be in everyone's best interest." Vivienne was very still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him no," Alderton said, "and then I came directly here." Vivienne stood and took her coat from the hook by the door. "Stay here," she said. "I will be back within the hour." She walked to Ashvale House in 25 minutes, which was faster than she usually walked anywhere. And she told the footman who answered the door that she needed to speak with Mr. Pemberton immediately. She was shown to the study, her father's study, the room she had sat in every morning for 8 years reviewing the estate correspondence. And Oliver came in 2 minutes later, still in his working clothes, a smear of ink on his right hand. She told him what good had done. Oliver listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You came directly here," he said. "Yes," Vivienne said. "You could have let it proceed," he said. "A delay would have given you time to—" "It would have given good time," she said. "That is not the same thing." She looked at him directly. "I am telling you because it was done against both of us, and you have the standing to act on it in ways that I currently do not." He understood what she was not saying, that this was the first thing she had done for him, and that she had done it knowing exactly what it cost her to walk through that door. "I will speak to Good today," he said. He did. Good resigned by the following morning and left the county within 48 hours, and his departure was the kind that generates comment. A solicitor of 40 years' standing, gone suddenly, no explanation offered, his office closed and his files locked. The county noticed. The county talked. Lady Crossmore called on Vivienne at the farm 4 days later. She arrived in a very good carriage with a very composed expression, and she accepted tea in the Kett's best parlor with the grace of a woman who has made herself at home in worse surroundings and intended no one to know it. "My dear," Lady Crossmore said, "I think we might find a way through this that preserves everyone's dignity. A private settlement, quietly managed. The county need not be involved. These things can be arranged without spectacle." Vivienne poured the tea. "I am sure they can," she said. "Then you will consider it," Lady Crossmore said. "No," Vivienne said pleasantly. "I intend the correction to be witnessed by anyone who is present to see the wrong. I was removed from my father's house on the church steps in front of half the county. The correction should happen in the same light." Lady Crossmore set her cup down. "That is not necessary," she said. "No one requires it of you." "Necessary is not the only reason to do a thing," Vivienne said. "Some things are done because they are right, and some things are done because the women who come after us will need to know they were done." Lady Crossmore looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not quite what Vivienne had expected. Not disapproval, but something more considered than that. She left without pressing the matter further, and Vivienne cleared the tea things herself and went back to her ledgers. She found the kitchen garden on a Tuesday morning, and she found it by accident. She had come to Ashvale on estate business. There were tenant letters she needed to retrieve from Alderton's copies. And she had taken the path around the walled garden because it was shorter. And she had looked through the iron gate as she passed and stopped walking. The beds had been turned. The late plantings were in. The overwintering greens, the garlic sets, the broad beans in their rows. The espalier on the south wall had been tied back for the season. Someone had done this work carefully and without announcement, and the garden looked, under the pale November sky, exactly as it should. Oliver was at the far end, working alongside two of the estate gardeners. No coat, his sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, moving between the beds with the focused attention of a man who has decided to be useful and is not performing it for anyone. He saw her when he straightened. He crossed the garden without hurrying, and she waited at the gate. "I did not tell you," he said when he reached her. "I should have. I did not know how to offer it without it sounding like—" He stopped. "I did not know how to offer it at all." "You tended my garden," Vivian said. "Your garden," he agreed. "Yes." She looked at him, at the hands that were now soil-dark as well as ink-stained, at the frost reddening the back of his neck, at the expression of a man who has been trying to say something for several days and has not yet found the words for it. "I do not know," Oliver said, "how to ask for the things I want to ask for." Vivian reached up and kissed him once, carefully, her hand briefly at his jaw. Then she stepped back. "Learn," she said. He came to her 2 days later with a different kind of offer. They were in Alderton's office in the market town, the three of them, the deed on the table between them, and Oliver said he had been thinking about how to proceed. He said he could arrange the transfer privately. The paperwork filed with the county record, the keys returned through Alderton, the estate formally restored to its rightful holder without requiring a public proceeding. He said he was offering it as the cleaner path. He said he meant it as a form of mercy. Vivienne listened to all of it. Then she said, "No." Oliver looked at her. "You did this in front of the county, Oliver," she said. "On the church steps, 30 minutes after my father's burial, in front of every person in this part of England who knew our families. You told me to leave my own house." She paused. "I am not saying this to wound you. I am saying it because the correction must be witnessed by the same people who witnessed the wrong, not for revenge. For every woman someone tries to remove from her own door and tells herself there is nothing to be done about it." Oliver was quiet for a long moment. "You want a formal proceeding?" he said. "I want a record," Vivian said. "A public one, so that it cannot be quietly undone in 20 years by someone who says it was all a private arrangement and no one can quite remember the details." Oliver nodded slowly. "I had already convened a legal meeting," he said. "Magistrate, my replacement solicitor, 2 county witnesses. I arranged it 4 days ago to formalize the title question." He looked at her steadily. "I will not rescind your access to it when I understand what you will bring." "I know," Vivian said. "That is why I told you what I wanted." The estate office at Ashvale was lit by 4 oil lamps on the night of the 15th of November, and it held more people than it had been designed to accommodate comfortably. The magistrate, Mr. Harlow, sat at the head of the long table. Oliver's replacement solicitor, a young man named Price, competent and visibly nervous, sat to his left. 2 county men, Marsh and a landowner named Fortescue, sat along the wall. Lady Crossmore stood near the window with 2 other county observers whom Price had apparently invited on Oliver's behalf, believing the meeting would confirm a straightforward title transfer. Oliver stood at the far end of the room when Vivian arrived with Alderton, and he did not move toward her. He watched her come through the door, and something in his expression settled. Not relief, not quite, but the particular look of a man who has been waiting for the ground to come up to meet him and is no longer afraid of the fall. Price had been speaking when they entered, reading from a prepared summary of the Pemberton claim. Oliver raised one hand, and Price stopped. "Before we proceed with what Mr. Price has prepared," Oliver said, "I would ask that Miss Ashvale be given the floor." Harlow looked up from his papers. "On what basis?" "On the basis," Oliver said, that she has a document that is material to the question before this meeting, and that it would be improper to proceed without it. Vivian set her document case on the table and drew out the deed. She did not unfold it immediately. She looked at the room, at Harlow, at Price, at the county men along the wall, at Lady Crossmore by the window. And she took her time, because she had learned that words spoken too early are wasted, and words spoken at the right moment change everything. Then she unfolded the deed and read 3 sentences aloud. She read the creation clause. She read the remainder provision. She read the date. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet, when everyone in them has just understood the same thing at the same moment. Harlow reached out. "May I examine it?" "Of course," Vivian said, and passed it across the table. Harlow read it slowly. He read the remainder clause twice. He set the document flat on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Oliver. Oliver stepped forward. He stood at the head of the table, and he did not look at his notes, because he had not prepared notes for this. He spoke the way a barrister speaks when he is no longer arguing a case, but simply telling the truth. "The Dukedom of Ashvale," Oliver said, "has been held by its rightful duchess since the death of her father. The remainder clause of the original creation deed, which I have seen and which Mr. Harlow now holds, provides unambiguously for descent to daughters of the blood in the absence of male heirs. There are no male heirs. There is a daughter of the blood. She is standing in this room." He paused. "My occupation of this estate was made in error, on the basis of suppressed legal information provided to my family over 40 years by my former solicitor, Mr. Hartley Good, who withheld the existence of this deed from the county record and from the estate's own legal representation. I will vacate Ashvale House and make full accounting of all estate correspondence, keys, and ledgers by morning. I ask that this statement be recorded." Harlow looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. The scratching of the nib on the record paper was the only sound in the room. Price had gone very still. Marsh, along the wall, exchanged a look with Fortescue that Vivian did not try to read. Alderton, standing beside her, let out a breath that was almost soundless. And then Lady Crossmore moved from her place by the window. She crossed the room with the deliberate composure of a woman who has made a decision and intends everyone present to witness her making it. She stopped in front of Vivian and looked at her. Really looked at her, the way she had not quite managed in the farm parlor over tea. And she dipped her chin in a gesture that was not quite a curtsy, but was near enough to one. "Your Grace," Lady Crossmore said. The title fell into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples of it moved outward to every person present, and no one in that office, on that night, could have said afterward that they had not heard it. Vivienne held Lady Crossmore's gaze. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was the quietest in the room, and it was the only one anyone was listening to. Oliver vacated Ashvale House by the following morning. He did it with the thoroughness of a man who has made a promise and understands that the manner of keeping it matters as much as the keeping. The ledgers he had found, those that had not already left with Vivienne, were returned to Alderton in good order, annotated in Oliver's own hand, where he had made entries during his occupation. The keys were returned on a ring, labeled in his handwriting. The correspondence he had generated in his weeks as presumed Duke was filed chronologically and left in the estate office with a covering letter to Vivienne explaining each item and its status. He did not leave the county. He was seen on the farm lane the following week, and at the kitchen garden gate 2 days after that, and at the market in the village on the Saturday, conducting himself with the unhurried attention of a man who has unfinished business that is no longer legal in nature. He spoke to Ket when he encountered him at the market, and to Marsh, and to the head gardener, and none of these conversations were brief. He was not performing contrition. He was learning the ground he had been standing on, without understanding it. Vivian saw him from the estate office window one afternoon, crossing the yard below with a bundle of drainage maps under his arm, maps she had not asked him to retrieve, from a county record office he had visited on his own. And she watched him until he disappeared around the corner of the outbuilding, and then she went back to her work. 3 weeks after the legal meeting, Oliver came to the estate office in the late afternoon to return the last of the papers he had been working through. He set them on the corner of the desk, and they went through them together for an hour. Vivienne asking questions, and Oliver answering them. And the work was easy between them, in the way that work is easy between people who understand the same things. When they had finished, he stood and gathered his coat from the chair back and looked at the window, where the early dark of November had come down while they were working. "I should start back," he said. 4 hours by coach. Vivienne looked up from the paper she was closing. "Where do you intend to go?" she asked. The office was very quiet. The lamp on the desk threw a warm circle of light across the leather blotter and the papers and the set of house keys that Vivienne had placed there that morning. The ring Oliver had returned to Alderton, which Alderton had returned to her. Oliver stood with his coat in his hand and did not move toward the door. Vivienne looked at him for a moment, and then she turned back to her work, smoothing the paper flat, dipping her pen. She did not press him. She had learned, over many years, not to press things before they were ready. The lamp burned steadily. The keys sat on the blotter between them. Outside, the wind moved across the Ashevale Valley, and the house held the sound of it the way it had always held the sound of it, in its walls, in its old stones, in the 8 years of work that had kept it standing while no one was watching. In the morning, there were 2 chairs at the desk. The keys were still on the blotter, between them, where they had been left,